Greetings and good Friday morning, this 13th of May, 2022, third decade of the 21st century. I always say that. I always normally give a preamble. Part of the reason I do that is because I'm always amazed at what we're entertaining and talking about in the mainstream versus where people thought we would be. And in some cases, if you stop and thinking about it, whether it's what people thought we were talking about, at the end of the day, certain people predicted that as a sign of progression or as a sign of evolution, that we would be talking about stuff that wasn't exactly, I wouldn't say allowed, but mainstream, or we would be talking about stuff that wasn't exactly normalized back in the day. And then, of course, it brings up the notion of different concepts. Like, I was talking with my therapist, and am I just at an age where I'm just too rigid? I'm just too stuck in a comfort zone, and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether that's a protective mechanism, and all the different various attributes about that. We talked about a great many things, like people who have a higher level of resilience, people who have a greater capacity to move on, or how certain things can affect us at a much deeper level for a much longer period of time, or we can temporarily get over it, but anytime something happens that triggers a memory, how it can create like deeper wounds, or it can create a longer lasting impression, where if the last time it affected you for a couple of months, now it's affecting you for like 6 months, and then once that subsides and then it happens again, then it affects you for like a year. And hopefully that makes sense. And I'll give you an example. It's a personal example. If you're new to my channel, I like to share. I have limited amounts of shame. I'm part of a local home brewing club. I enjoy making beer. Making beer is very, very similar to cooking. Essentially, you take ingredients and you make a sugar water known as wort. And then once you've done what you had to do, you cool it off, and then you add yeast. The yeast has a chemical reaction with sugar that creates alcohol through a process known as fermentation. Now, not all of the sugar is converted to yeast or is converted to alcohol necessarily, so you can still have a sweetness, which is why in the cooking process or brewing process, there are various things you can do to add different flavors. More specifically, we like to use hops or other bittering spices to remove some of that residual sweetness. But anyways, I digress. It's a fun hobby. It can be a very expensive hobby, but it's a fun hobby, and I'm part of a local home brewing club. And a few years ago, an on again, off again member who's like a habitual entrepreneur, always hustling, always trying to start something, whether it's successful or not. Most recently, it doesn't seem as though he's been terribly successful, and I don't know about his previous history. He took over the local home brew shop, which was started by a retired Marine colonel who basically wanted to support his own habit of making wine and making beer, but also help others. And it was a cute little shop. It was kind of tucked away. It wasn't in the greatest spot for traffic, etc. But whether his own health issues or his wife's health issues, he sold the shop. And the guy who took it over had these great grand plans, and for the most part, I was kind of on board. I was basically supporting him. Long story short, he is a very hard lefty. He's an extreme liberal. He's a Democrat. We don't know if that's his personal feelings or if it's his wife's feelings, because his wife is very successful. His wife is well educated. She owns a dental practice. So, some of us don't know how much of it is, him being influenced by his sugar mama. But he started to allow his personal politics to become part of his identity, also known as identity politics, and he also allowed it to penetrate his business. Now, I don't know if he hired somebody who shared his views, or if he influenced this other person with his own views, and then they started to share his views as a result of influence through employment. But the short version is somehow, and don't ask me how, but I was a dumbass, and I fell for a conversation. I showed up one day to pick up some ingredients that I had pre-ordered, and I don't know how, but a conversation was started. Before you can understand that, you have to understand the further backstory. I walk into the establishment. There's nobody to be seen, but the door's open, and I'm like, don't ask me why. Just one of those things where something just felt off, and I was like, ooh. Let me just stand right here where, whether you're outside or inside, you can see I'm right here and I'm not doing anything suspicious. Excuse me. A little bit of cola, mostly pink lemonade. Delicious. The young woman that was working there, that I was talking about previously with the influence and whatnot, was apparently preparing for her next job. Working at the homebrew supply store was a part-time job, and I didn't know this. So I stayed right there in the doorway by the cash register area, and she came out and we exchanged pleasantries, a little bit of sarcasm, and then we conducted our business. And then out of nowhere, I wish I could tell you how it started. Maybe it was me, maybe it wasn't. I wasn't seeking therapy yet, so I don't know if maybe I initiated it or she initiated it, but we had a conversation. And what I remember distinctly is her talking about the parties switching and Strom Thurmond, which I know for a fact I had heard on numerous occasions from the new owner of the shop. And I was like, that is not technically true. That is pinned on several different things, and I made a video to this, but I'm gonna shorten it and paraphrase it. So, back in the day, in the 60s, there was a group known as Dixiecrats, Democrats from Dixieland, whatever that is, the South of the Mason-Dixon, the former Confederate States, people that held true to those types of ideologies. Well, there were 23 senators that were all staunch Democrats, and they disagreed with Lyndon Johnson, who was attempting to change some of the political strategies of the Democratic Party based on the popularity of President John F. Kennedy, who Johnson succeeded upon his assassination. Kennedy himself was not a true blue Democrat. He ran as a Democrat because of his dad's money. His dad was a blue blood Democrat. Kennedy was not, and Kennedy was a rather popular figure for not being your atypical Democrat. I guess very much like you would say Donald Trump was not your atypical Republican. He was a popular figure, good, bad, or indifferent. So these 23 Dixiecrats disagreed with Johnson's change of strategy, which was entertaining the civil rights, entertaining the voting laws. Certain things that the Democrats were staunchly against, because the Democrats were staunchly for segregation. They were staunchly for racism and bigotry. That was their tenets. It just is what it is. Anyways, we had a conversation, and I remember distinctly after defending it, I was like, okay, but do me a favor. You're a college student. You're an educated woman. Research it yourself. I can back up my sources, because at the time I think I was still in college pursuing my second bachelor's, and I was like, I can back this up. I've done the research. All right, out of those 23 Dixiecrats, only Strom Thurmond flipped to being Republican, and Strom Thurmond was not responsible for flipping the Republican Party. All right, the Republican Party didn't all of a sudden exchange, whatever for the hoods and robes and the burning crosses of the Democratic Party. But everybody pinned it to that. And then, of course, everybody liked to pin it to the fact that the South was increasingly turning Republican And the reason they were turning Republican was because of the number of black women who were employed at retardedly low wages to be nannies to Southern children, who those children had a more dynamic view of the world, a more open mind, and did not see these women and subsequently black Americans as substandard humans, as subhuman. You know, they saw them as good, genuine human beings and people. And it was those children being raised by those nannies that, as they progressed and got older, slowly changed the political landscape of the South. The Democratic Party gained a foothold in the North through the labor unions, specifically through poor whites, as in Irish, Italian, Polish, you name it. All right? So it still had its racist roots. It was just reaching out to poor whites, starting in New York, you know, through the labor union system, which is why in the North the Democrats dominate the labor unions, because it's a legacy thing. But I digress. Getting back to that experience, so I explained all that. I defended my position, and I challenged her to, you know, do her own research, and don't just believe in anecdotes. Don't just believe in what, you know, people are opinionating on. Go and do your research, and then if you still maintain that disposition, I would more than happily debate you, you know, at on an intellectual level. That quickly turned. I told my buddy who was the president of the club, and I was like, yeah, man, you know, I feel completely stupid for having this conversation and entertaining this conversation, and I feel like there's going to be some fallout. And he goes, funny you mention that, because you're right. There is some fallout. And I was like, oh, okay. Trust me when I say it went in a completely different direction. She accused me of things that had absolutely nothing to do with the conversation. And this is why I brought up all these details. She accused me of essentially pinning her in the bathroom. So the bathroom is at the back end of the store. The store is maybe 30 feet deep, give or take. I could be wrong. It could be a little bit deeper, maybe 35. So from the door where I was standing to the door of the bathroom, which is in the way, way back, all right, up against the back wall, she accused me of pinning her in the bathroom and kind of like, hey, you know, mon chéri. At the risk of being offensive, I found that to be belligerently offensive, because it was indicating as though I had a sexual attraction to her and I was acting upon it. And I'm like, what in the fuck does that have to do with the conversation? Like, I can understand if she was upset at the conversation. I can understand if she was upset at the at the decorum of talking about things like religion and politics. But this, and apparently like she was like convincing herself that this happened, and I was like, no. I don't find her attractive at all. And that never had any bearing on our business dealings. I always thought she was probably the best thing going for that shop, because the guy who owned it was a business idiot, and he was running it to the ground, especially with his identity politics. But I just could not utterly believe the accusation. I was like, first and foremost, you were not pinned or felt pinned or confined to that back area, because I sat there in the doorway and I physically watched you walk all the way out over to the cash register to ring me out, where you stayed behind the makeshift bar that this guy had created. And there was always an appropriate social distance. So why do I say that? Because it had an awkward impact on me and the club, and it just had an awkward impact on the club, and it just, man, did it leave a really, really sour impression. And it also reminded me of an incident that took place in my very first civilian job. It just triggered a memory of what I believe to be a false or fabricated accusation, a false flag, if you will. And it was convenient because there were no witnesses, so it's a literal he said she said. At a time when we're dealing with the hashtag Me Too movement and whatnot. So, and then listening to the stories that she was telling the other club members of her reliving the experience, and I'm like, that is utterly untrue. Nothing of the sort ever happened. Especially when you consider the fact that I'm not attracted to her. Forget the fact that I'm married. All right, forget the fact that I'm happily married to a woman who's much prettier than I deserve. All right, and I relish naked time opportunities. And I do everything to preserve naked time because she's in charge of naked time. That's just the way that I operate. All right, I'm not in charge of naked time. She is. I was, first and foremost, I was insulted at the insinuation that I was attracted to her. Like, she just automatically assumed because she's got a vagina and boobs, and pee sitting down, that I was automatically attracted to her. And I'm like, you don't get to determine who I'm attracted to. You don't get to assume that I'm automatically attracted to you just because you have lady parts. And then you add the factor that I'm married, happily married, got my fucking wedding ring tattooed on my goddamn finger. I was doubly insulted. So where am I going with this? That incident triggered the memory of something that took place during my first civilian job as a brand new civilian right out of the service after having lost my son. It brought up a lot of really, really bad memories and a lot of bad emotions. I would eventually recover. Then a few months ago, November of last year, going into November, December timeframe, something else happened. Most of it was hearsay. People relaying information may have relayed it incorrectly or while inebriated or several other mitigating factors. But the long story is this. It just ignited that whole memory of that particular incident, of that accusation within the brew club, home brew store arena. And, it hit me hard because somewhere somebody either intentionally, unintentionally, unwittingly, unwillingly stirred the pot. They yeah, not quite paying attention to the potential consequences of their actions or purposely doing it with willful intent, stirred up the pot in my name. And I bring it up because a new home brew shop opened a little over a year ago, and basically some of what happened involved one of the owners of the home brew shop, somewhat indirectly. So the short version is this. A friend of mine, somebody I consider like an older brother, had contacted me and said that, hey, look, man, somebody told me that you were saying some shit about me and it really upset me. And I was like, upset because you believed I said it, or upset because, what was said, period? Like, upset at the situation. And he's like, well, it's hard to say because I wasn't there, so a part of me believes and a part of me is skeptical. And it really pissed me off because I was like, look, man, I don't say anything in your absence that I don't say to your face. I just don't believe in that. I believe in being completely blunt and honest. And it bothered me that he was upset. It bothered me that somebody, regardless of why, went out of their way to, hey, this stuff happened. Have an opinion. Have an emotion. Mission accomplished. That's what bothered me. And I don't know if the person did it willingly. I don't even know who it is. I have an idea. And tragically, if I'm right, I really would like to believe the person had no idea what they were doing, had zero intentions of that happening, just maybe had a few drinks in them, was socially lubed up and just started talking about stuff, not realizing how he was communicating and Yeah, it's a he, and how it was going to potentially impact my friend who was listening, and then how it would eventually impact me on the back end. So good. And then additionally, I heard about comments from one of the three owners of the local home brew store, who happens to be female, and it just stirred up all those memories of the other incident with that female employee at that other home brew shop that has since then failed. And it was just like, ugh. So what I did was I removed myself from the situation. I stopped going to gatherings. I stopped participating in club events. I haven't patroned the shop, but due to circumstances, I need to repatronize the shop. And I'm preparing myself for the potential awkwardness. But having all that been said, I'm curious to hear from anybody who may be watching this video, whether you've experienced anything similar, whether you've, had to make the decision where, the one thing you can control is you. So in this particular situation, the only thing I could control was my involvement and my participation. I stopped patronizing the store. I stopped going to gatherings because they were being hosted at the local home brew store. And furthermore, I stopped going to gatherings because without knowing who was saying things on my behalf with the potential consequence or willful intent to anger and disturb others on my behalf, you can't do it if I'm not there. You can't do it if I'm not participating. And the funny thing is, my buddy who got upset, he also stopped participating. Now, on the flip side of that, I've also found it convenient that if I'm not participating, I now have the time to do other things, like work on renovating my future studio / cosplay shop. But I digress. Now that I've said a lot about me, I'm curious to hear from some of you. Have you experienced anything similar? How did you deal with it? Did you deal with it much in the same? What are your thoughts, views, and opinions? Was it appropriate? Was it inappropriate? Was it an overreaction? Or do you think it's entirely appropriate because, if for no other reason, whether it's stirring up memories, whether it's impacting you in a harmful way because now you're walking on eggshells, whatever the case may be, I'd like to hear from you. So, if you made it this far, and if you're going to leave a comment and tell me about your situation or whatever, you're awesome.